Kim Philby seemed like the perfect English gentleman. He was born into an upper-class family, educated at Cambridge, spoke with the confidence of someone who never had to raise his voice to be heard.
Yes,
Everyone was drawn to him. As author Ben McIntyre put it, he was the sort of man who won worshippers. You didn't just like him, admire him, agree with him. You worshipped him. But he wasn't what he seemed. While Britain believed Philby was serving king and country, he was secretly serving the Soviet Union. This is the story of the most devastating traitor in the history of British intelligence. The Soviets recruited Philby straight out of Cambridge, where he'd been swept up in leftist revolutionary ideas. He became convinced that the rich had exploited the poor for far too long. Upon graduating, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. I left the university with a conviction that my life must be devoted to communism. Through his first wife, Litzy Friedman, a committed communist, Philby was introduced to a man who called himself Otto, the chief recruiter for Soviet intelligence in Britain. To Philby, joining Soviet intelligence was a no-brainer. One does not look twice at an offer of enrollment in an elite force. Philby brought others who shared his worldview into the fold. They became known as the Cambridge Five, a group of British students secretly recruited by Soviet intelligence. While posing as a newspaper correspondent during the Spanish Civil War, Philby gathered military intelligence that he secretly fed back to Moscow. And when World War II loomed, he joined MI6 thanks to his charm and connections, befriending a fellow journalist in a first-class compartment who introduced him to her intelligence contacts. Philby rose quickly through the ranks of MI6, charming everyone who mattered. As author Ben McIntyre writes in A Spy Among Friends, Philby cultivated, flattered, and despised them all. He joined Section 5 of MI6, responsible for hunting enemy spies while secretly working as one himself. One of his most devastating betrayals came in 1943 when he learned that Erich Vermehren, an officer in Germany's military intelligence agency, the Abwehr, wanted to defect. He and his wife were deeply religious and horrified by Nazi brutality. Vermehren approached British intelligence, offering valuable information in exchange for safe passage to the West. Philby's close friend, MI6 officer Nicholas Elliott, staged a fake kidnapping as cover for the couple's escape after a cocktail party at the Spanish embassy in Istanbul, where he was stationed. The couple was smuggled to the coast, whisked across the sea to Cairo, and finally flown to London. Vermehren brought complete organizational charts of the Abwehr and, crucially, a list of Catholic anti-communist activists in Germany. With the war nearing its end, the Allies were planning for post-war Europe and hoped to support these activists in building a democratic, anti-communist Germany to serve as a buffer against Soviet expansion. What did Philby do? Philby gave the entire list to Moscow, and the Soviets eliminated them. Philby would later admit, "I was responsible for the deaths of a considerable number of Germans." As Nazi Germany fell, British intelligence turned its attention to the rising threat of the Soviet Union. Philby proposed the creation of Section 9, a special unit within MI6 to counter Soviet espionage. He made sure he would lead it, pushing out the frontrunner Felix Kalgil. Philby wrote, "I must do everything, but everything, to ensure that I become head of Section 9. He began quietly undermining his colleagues' reputation, suggesting to senior officials that Kalgil couldn't work well with MI5, Britain's domestic security agency. His scheming worked. In September 1944, Philby became the head of Section 9. The job of protecting Britain from Soviet spies would be handed to a Soviet spy. He exposed everything: plans for D-Day, details of the atomic bomb program, British and American intelligence networks operating across Europe. Philby had control, influence, access, and little concern for those who got in the way. In 1945, Soviet intelligence officer Konstantin Volkov approached British officials in Istanbul offering to defect. He promised to reveal the identities of more than 300 Soviet agents, including a deep-cover mole inside British counterintelligence, Kim Philby himself. Philby realized the danger and convinced the head of MI6, Sir Stuart Menzies, that he should personally go to Istanbul to oversee the extraction. But instead of acting quickly, Philby delayed. As McIntyre writes, Philby now gave the impression of busily making preparations while dragging his feet as slowly as possible. Philby met with a Soviet handler to tip off Moscow. When he finally arrived in Istanbul, he reported that Volkov and his wife had disappeared. In reality, the Soviets had captured and killed them. Philby later said of Volkov, he deserved what he got. Shortly after came one of the worst intelligence failures of the Cold War, Operation Valuable. Philby knew every detail of the covert British mission to infiltrate Albania and trigger an uprising against the communist dictator Enver Hoxha, who was closely aligned with Moscow. MI6 trained Albanian nationalists for the task, but they never stood a chance. Philby leaked everything to the Soviets: dates, times, landing points, weapons, ensuring the agents would be ambushed on arrival. While they were being hunted down in the hills of Albania, Philby was sipping champagne aboard a luxury ocean liner. He had just been appointed MI6's station chief in Washington. In D.C., he struck up a close friendship with James Angleton, a rising star at the CIA who would later become chief of counterintelligence. They feasted on lobster and wine every other day for lunch. As one officer later wrote, Philby must have picked him clean. While Philby was cultivating relationships in America's capital, the Americans were closing in. The top-secret VENONA project had begun decrypting Soviet communications, including messages referring to a Soviet agent in Washington codenamed Homer. By the early 1950s, analysts concluded that Homer was Donald Maclean, one of the Cambridge Five. Philby saw the VENONA material and knew Maclean's cover was about to be blown, which could ultimately expose him. But he had no way to alert Maclean, who was now back in London. It just so happened that Guy Burgess, the other Soviet mole in DC, was being recalled to London after getting into trouble. He'd been recklessly speeding through Virginia, claiming diplomatic immunity, infuriating police and the governor. While Burgess and Philby dined at a DC restaurant and plotted how to warn Maclean, Philby jokingly said to Burgess, "Don't you go too." But Burgess did. In June 1951, both Burgess and Maclean disappeared, slipping out of Britain and defecting to Moscow. Philby was summoned to London to assist with the investigation, but behind the scenes, people suspected him of being the third man who had tipped them off. CIA officer Bill Harvey sent a scathing memo to MI6. Philby was a Soviet spy. MI6 investigators began connecting the dots. Philby's close ties to Burgess, the Volkov affair, the failed Albanian operation, and now Maclean's escape. MI5's legal advisor, Buster Milmo, interrogated Philby, but Philby wouldn't crack. Milmo later concluded, "There's no hope of a confession, but he's as guilty as hell." Still, Philby had his defenders. The CIA's James Angleton remained blindly loyal. And his closest friend at MI6, Nicholas Elliott, wouldn't or couldn't believe Philby was a traitor. As McIntyre writes, Philby was his friend, his mentor, his ally, and in the world inhabited by Nicholas Elliott, that meant he simply could not be a Soviet spy. Philby publicly denied everything, even holding a press conference in his mother's dining room, serving beer and sherry to reporters.
I consider his action deplorable. On the subject of friendship, I prefer to say as little as possible because it's very complicated.
Mr. Philby, Mr. Macmillan, the Foreign Secretary, said there was no evidence that you were the so-called third man who allegedly tipped off Burgess and Maclean. Are you satisfied with that clearance that he gave you?
Yes, I am.
The Soviets were impressed by his performance. His KGB handler, Yuri Modin, later wrote, "Kim played his cards with consummate cunning. We concluded, just as he had, that the British government had no serious evidence against him." One person who suspected the truth was his second wife, Aileen Furse, whom he met while she worked undercover as a store detective at Marks & Spencer. She wondered why he had waited so long to divorce his first wife, a known communist, and noticed how close he was with Burgess, who had lived with them for a time. Aileen began drinking heavily and spiraled into depression. Philby ended up spending the next year and a half in a dull import-export job, and yet MI6 eventually brought him back, thanks to his powerful friend Nicholas Elliott, who continued to believe in his innocence. Philby was posted to Beirut under the cover of being a journalist. While in Lebanon, he began an affair with Eleanor Brewer, the wife of a New York Times correspondent, leaving Aileen back in England with the children, where she drank herself to death. Philby described her death as a wonderful escape, as he was now free to marry Eleanor. They adopted a pet fox named Jackie, a symbol of cunning, perhaps mirroring Philby's web of deception. But when Jackie fell from their balcony and died, Philby was devastated. It felt like an omen, marking the start of Philby's unraveling. When MI6 officer George Blake was exposed as a Soviet spy and sentenced to 42 years in prison, Philby was terrified. Soon after, KGB defector Anatoly Golitsyn warned the West of a ring of 5 Soviet moles, all recruited from the University of Cambridge. But what really dug Philby in was Flora Solomon, an Anglo-Jewish woman who moved in the same circles as Philby in the 1930s. Philby's journalism disturbed her. She noticed how he parroted Soviet talking points in the Middle East, especially his anti-Israel bias, which aligned with Moscow's support of Arab states. While on a trip to Israel, Flora said to her friend Victor Rothschild, the renowned scientist who once headed MI5's explosives division, "How is it the Observer uses a man like Kim? Don't they know he's a communist?" Then she dropped a bombshell: that Philby had tried to recruit her into Soviet intelligence in the 1930s, telling her he was doing a very dangerous job for peace. She kept this to herself for decades because she assumed the 1950s investigations into Philby were just McCarthy-era witch hunts. But Flora Solomon refused to testify publicly against Philby, terrified the KGB would assassinate her. So MI6 and the British government decided they'd have to try to get Philby to confess. On January 12, 1963, Philby was invited to a meeting at the flat of the Beirut station chief secretary, supposedly to discuss his future with MI6. But when the door opened, he saw another familiar face. Nicholas Elliott, his old friend, his fiercest defender, had come to confront him. "I rather thought it would be you," Philby said. As Ben McIntyre wrote, once Elliott would have died for Philby. Now, as he told his son, he would happily have killed him. They sat across from each other, drinking tea, pretending to be civil, while MI6 had bugged the apartment and recorded every word. Elliott didn't waste time. "I came to tell you that your past has caught up with you." Philby lashed back. "Have you all gone mad once again? You want to start all that? After all these years? You've lost your sense of humor. You'll be a laughing stock." But Elliott didn't flinch. "Listen, Kim, you know I was on your side from the moment there were suspicions about you. But now there is new information. They've shown it to me. And now even I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that you worked for the Soviet intelligence services." Philby didn't even ask what the new information was. "Who told you that nonsense? It's totally absurd, and you know yourself it's absurd." Elliott wasn't having any of it. "You took me in for years. Now I'll get the truth out of you, even if I have to drag it out. You had to choose between Marxism and your family, and you chose Marxism. I once looked up to you, Kim. My God, how I despise you now. I hope you have enough decency left to understand why." Philby responded, "I'm sure we can work something out." Elliott offered him a deal: full immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full confession. Every Soviet contact, every mole, every betrayal. But Philby left without agreeing. The next day, he offered a partial confession, admitting he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s and confessed to tipping off Maclean, but he lied and said he had stopped spying after World War II. And he refused to name any Soviet contacts. Soon after, he met with a Soviet handler to warn MI6 was closing in. Moscow decided Philby needed to be extracted immediately. A few days later, Philby spotted his handler walking past his apartment carrying a book, a prearranged signal that the extraction was a go. On January 23, 1963, Philby told his wife Eleanor he was just stepping out briefly and that he'd meet her at a dinner party later. But he never returned. He was smuggled out in a Soviet diplomatic car, driven to the coast, and boarded a freighter bound for Odessa. Eleanor panicked when he didn't show up for the dinner party. When she reported him missing, MI6 quickly suspected he had fled, but they didn't attempt to intercept the ship. Some believe British intelligence let him go to avoid the embarrassment of a public trial. When Philby arrived in Moscow, he was granted citizenship, given a furnished apartment, and a modest stipend, but he wasn't hailed a hero. The KGB never fully trusted him. The country he betrayed everything for never truly felt like home. He drank English tea, smeared Marmite on his toast, and listened to the BBC. Eleanor decided to follow him to Moscow, but the marriage didn't last. One day, Eleanor asked, "What's more important to you, me and the children, or the Communist Party?" Philby replied, "The party, of course." She left him. Philby later married a Russian-Polish woman 20 years younger than him, Rufina Pukova. And astonishingly, he wrote to Nicholas Elliott as if nothing had happened, suggesting they meet secretly in Helsinki or Berlin, signing off, "Let me hear from you soon. Love to Elizabeth," referring to Elliott's wife. Elliott replied coldly, "I wrote back and told him to put some flowers on Volkov's grave for me. I thought that was rather good." Philby's escape devastated those who had once trusted him. At the CIA, James Angleton never recovered and became obsessed with rooting out Soviet moles, which crippled US intelligence for years. Nicholas Elliott was left haunted. He never stopped wondering how a man so similar to him, same class, same schools, could turn out so utterly different. Philby once said of his motivation, "I have always operated on two levels, a personal level and a political one. When the two have come into conflict, I have had to put politics first. But in the end, his politics couldn't save him from disappointment. His fourth wife later said Philby was disillusioned with communism by the end of his life and tried to drink himself to death. Kim believed in a just society and devoted his whole life to communism. And here he was, struck by disappointment, brought to tears. He said, "Why do old people live so badly here? After all, they won the war." Kim Philby died of heart failure on May 11, 1988 at the age of 76. A traitor to his country, a man who fooled everyone, perhaps even himself. And while Philby spied for Moscow, today it's data brokers quietly spying on you. You know what shocked me recently? Someone sent a work-related email to my personal email address, and I wondered how they got it. And that's when I realized that my personal email was sitting on a random website for everyone to see. It's scary how much of your private information is online without you realizing it. Data brokers collect your personal information and sell it to anyone willing to pay. That's why I personally use and trust DeleteMe, the sponsor of today's video. Just this month, DeleteMe's privacy experts searched 330 sites for my personal data and found my name, phone number, email, property value, even my relatives listed on a data broker. With that information, it's possible for someone to impersonate you and commit insurance fraud or other financial crimes in your name. The FTC reported consumers lost $12.5 billion to fraud in 2024, a 25% increase over 2023. DeleteMe doesn't just scan once. They keep monitoring and removing your data every month to make sure it stays private. It was incredibly easy to get started. I signed up, quickly completed my profile, and waited for my first report to show what DeleteMe had uncovered. If you want to protect yourself and your loved ones online, I highly recommend checking out DeleteMe. You can visit joindeleteme.com/newsthink. The link is in the description, and use my promo code newsthink for 20% off at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/newsthink, and don't forget to add the promo code newsthink for an additional 20% off at checkout. Thanks so much for watching. For Newsthink, I'm Cindy Pom.